If you can't control your emotions, then don't serve my table. Edward Whitmore's voice sliced through the restaurant so sharply that even the piano player in the corner missed a note. Every fork paused midair. Every whispered conversation died beneath the crystal chandeliers. Naomi Carter froze beside table 12, her trembling hand still wrapped around the neck of an expensive wine bottle, her eyes wide with panic as one tear slipped free and rolled down her cheek before falling onto the white linen tablecloth below. The silence that followed was suffocating. Naomi's throat tightened so badly she could barely breathe. "I'm sorry, sir," she whispered, her voice cracking under the weight of humiliation as dozens of wealthy strangers turned to stare at her. Edward leaned back slowly in his leather chair, cold gray eyes fixed on her like she had inconvenienced him simply by existing. At 42, Edward Whitmore was the kind of billionaire whose name appeared in business magazines every month, the kind of man who owned skyscrapers, private jets, and half the city block they stood on, and tonight he wore his usual expression, the detached, polished stare of someone who had forgotten how to feel anything at all. Naomi quickly wiped her face and reached for his glass with shaking fingers. "I apologize, sir. It won't happen again." But Edward's jaw tightened. "You're crying while serving a $5,000 dinner. Get yourself together." A few guests nearby exchanged uncomfortable glances. One woman lowered her eyes. Another quietly sipped champagne, pretending not to watch. Naomi nodded quickly, swallowing the lump in her throat so hard it hurt. "Yes, sir. Of course, sir." Then she turned and walked away as fast as she could, heels clicking against polished marble, every step threatening to shatter what little dignity she had left. She pushed through the kitchen doors and didn't stop until she reached the back alley behind the restaurant, where cold rain poured from the black sky in silver sheets and soaked her uniform almost instantly. Her breath came out in broken gasps as she pressed one hand over her mouth, trying to quiet the sob building in her chest. She bent forward, shoulders shaking, tears mixing with rainwater as neon light from the restaurant sign reflected in puddles around her feet. Tonight was too much. Everything was too much. Her phone still sat heavy in her apron pocket, the screen cracked, the voicemail notification still glowing from 30 minutes earlier, the hospital calling again, reminding her that her little brother Isaiah's condition had worsened. That if she wanted to be there, she should come soon. But she couldn't leave. She couldn't lose another shift. She couldn't lose the rent money. She couldn't lose everything. The metal door behind her suddenly creaked open. Naomi straightened instantly, wiping her face, but froze when she saw Edward Whitmore step outside beneath the dim yellow security light, his tailored black coat catching droplets of rain. He looked at her with irritation first, then confusion. "You're still crying?" he asked flatly. Naomi stared at him, stunned by the question, mascara streaking faintly beneath her eyes. Edward crossed his arms. "Why are you this upset over one embarrassing moment?" Naomi laughed once, a broken, bitter sound that barely qualified as laughter. Then she looked up at him, rain dripping from her lashes, and whispered the words that made his entire body go still. "Because my little brother is dying at St. Mary's Hospital." Her voice cracked so hard she nearly couldn't finish. "And I can't afford to leave work to say goodbye." And in that instant, Edward Whitmore's face lost all color, because those were the exact same words his wife had spoken to him 10 years ago, the night before she died. Edward Whitmore did not move. For a moment, the rain around them seemed to disappear, the city noise faded, and all he could hear was the pounding of his own heartbeat in his ears. Naomi stood trembling beneath the dim light, soaked and exhausted, staring at him with eyes too tired to care how broken she looked anymore. But Edward could not speak because her words had dragged him somewhere he had spent 10 years trying to forget. He still remembered that night with painful clarity. The cold hospital room. The sound of machines humming softly in the dark. His wife, Claire, pale and weak in the bed, looking up at him with tears in her eyes as she whispered, "I wish you would stay, but I know your meetings matter more." He had kissed her forehead and promised he would come back after just one dinner with investors. By the time he returned, she was gone. And for 10 years, that moment haunted him every single night. Edward swallowed hard, his chest tightening beneath his coat as Naomi wiped her eyes and stepped back, embarrassed by her own honesty. "I am sorry," she whispered shakily. "I should not have said that. Please just forget it." But Edward's voice came out low and strained. "What hospital did you say?" Naomi blinked in confusion. "St. Mary's, downtown." Edward stared at her for half a second longer before suddenly pulling out his phone. "Get your things!" Naomi frowned. "What?" "Get your things," he repeated, firmer this time. "You are leaving." Her face dropped instantly. "Please, sir, I know I messed up tonight, but I cannot lose this job. I need this money. I swear I will do better, Naomi." His tone softened for the first time all evening. "You are not fired." She froze. Rainwater dripped from her chin as she stared at him in disbelief. Edward slipped his phone back into his pocket and gestured toward the street. "My driver is pulling around. You are going to the hospital." Naomi's mouth parted, but no words came out. "Sir? I cannot ask you for that." "You did not ask." His voice was quieter now, almost distant. "Go see your brother." Her eyes filled instantly with fresh tears, but this time they were different. Softer. Full of disbelief instead of pain. She pressed both hands over her mouth as emotion overtook her. "Why?" she whispered. Edward looked away toward the rain-slicked street, jaw tightening. "Because 10 years ago." He paused, his voice roughening. "Someone I loved begged me to stay, and I chose work instead." Naomi stared at him silently as understanding flickered across her face. The black town car rolled smoothly to the curb beside them, headlights glowing against the wet pavement. Edward opened the rear door himself. "Get in." Naomi hesitated only 1 second before climbing inside. Still shaking. Edward followed after her, adjusting his cuffs as the driver pulled away into the storm. For the first several blocks, neither of them spoke. The leather interior smelled faintly of cedar and expensive cologne, but Naomi barely noticed. Her hands twisted nervously in her lap. "His name is Isaiah," she whispered finally. Edward turned slightly. "He is 13. Leukemia." Her voice cracked on the last word. "It was getting better for a while, then last week everything changed." Edward listened quietly, his usual cold expression gone, replaced by something unreadable. Naomi looked down. "He keeps asking if I am coming tonight. I told him yes, but..." Her throat tightened again. "I did not know if I would make it." Edward stared out the rain-covered window for a long moment before speaking softly, almost to himself. "Some people spend their whole lives chasing money because they think it will fix the emptiness inside them." Naomi looked at him. Edward's eyes stayed fixed ahead. Then one day they realized they traded everything that mattered for numbers on paper. Naomi studied his face, seeing not a billionaire now, but a man carrying years of regret behind expensive suits and perfect posture. And for the first time since meeting him, she realized Edward Whitmore looked far sadder than he ever did cruel. The hospital came into view ahead, glowing against the dark night sky. But neither of them knew that what would happen inside those walls was about to change both of their lives forever. The moment Naomi stepped into Isaiah's hospital room, the fear in her chest shattered into relief so sharp it nearly dropped her to her knees. Her little brother lay pale against the white pillows, his thin frame swallowed by blankets far too large for his body. But the second he saw her standing in the doorway, his tired face lit up. "You came," he whispered, his voice weak but smiling. Naomi rushed to his bedside instantly, tears spilling freely now as she wrapped her arms around him with trembling hands. "Of course I came, baby," she whispered, brushing his curls back from his forehead. "I will always come." Edward remained in the doorway, silent and still, watching the scene unfold from a distance. Something inside him twisted painfully as he watched Isaiah cling to Naomi's hand like she was the only thing keeping his world together. He remembered another hospital room. Another hand. Another person begging him not to leave. And again guilt washed over him so hard it almost stole his breath. Naomi sat beside the bed for several minutes, whispering softly to Isaiah, smiling through tears, asking how he felt, pretending everything was fine the way older siblings often did when they were trying to hide fear from someone younger. But eventually a nurse entered quietly, clipboard in hand, and her smile faded the second she noticed Edward Whitmore standing behind Naomi. Recognition flashed across her face immediately. "Mr. Whitmore?" she asked, stunned. Edward gave a polite nod, but Naomi barely noticed. She stood quickly when the nurse's expression shifted. "What is it?" Naomi asked. The nurse hesitated. "Dr. Reynolds needs to speak with you. In private." Naomi's entire body tensed. "Why?" The nurse gave the kind of look that answered everything before words ever could. Naomi slowly stood from Isaiah's bedside, her face draining of color. Edward watched her disappear into the hallway with the nurse, then glanced toward Isaiah, who now stared at the ceiling with a sadness far too mature for 13 years old. Edward slowly stepped inside. "Hey," he said awkwardly. Isaiah turned his head. "You are the rich guy from television." Edward almost laughed despite himself. "Sometimes." Isaiah studied him carefully. "Why are you here with my sister?" Edward hesitated. "I gave her a ride." Isaiah nodded once. "She cries when she thinks I do not hear her." The bluntness of the statement made Edward's chest tighten. "She loves you very much." Isaiah smiled faintly. "I know. That is why I pretend to sleep when she cries." Edward swallowed hard, caught off guard by the honesty. Before he could respond, Naomi suddenly reappeared in the doorway, and one look at her face told him everything. Her lips trembled violently. Her eyes were red. She could barely stand upright. Edward moved immediately. "What happened?" Naomi tried to speak, but the words would not come at first. Finally she forced them out in a whisper so broken it barely sounded human. "His treatment stopped working." Edward's stomach dropped. Naomi covered her mouth as tears poured down her face. "They found another option, but..." Her shoulders shook violently. "Insurance will not cover it. It is experimental and costs over $180,000. The room went silent. Even the machine seemed quieter somehow. Naomi let out one shattered breath and sank into the chair beside Isaiah's bed, burying her face in her hands. "I have been working doubles for months," she sobbed softly. "I skipped meals, sold my car, picked up every shift they gave me, and it still is not enough. It is never enough." Edward stared at her, unable to look away. There was no pride left in her now. No mask. No forced smile. Just raw desperation from someone fighting a battle she knew she was losing. Then Isaiah reached over weakly and touched Naomi's arm. "It is okay, Nini," he whispered gently. "You tried." That simple sentence destroyed Edward. Because in that moment, hearing a dying child comfort the person trying to save him, something inside the billionaire cracked wide open. Edward turned toward the window, blinking hard as emotions surged unexpectedly into his chest. Then he slowly reached into his coat pocket, pulled out his phone, and said the words that would change everything. "No," he said quietly, his voice steady now. "He is getting that treatment. Tomorrow morning." Naomi looked up instantly, stunned. "What?" Edward met her tear-filled eyes. "Because if money is the only thing standing between your brother and his life..." He swallowed once, his jaw tightening. "Then that problem just disappeared." Naomi stared at Edward Whitmore as if she had misheard him. The fluorescent hospital lights reflected in her tear-filled eyes while the room around them seemed to freeze in place. Even the nurse standing by the door stopped moving. "You cannot be serious," Naomi whispered, her voice trembling beneath the weight of disbelief. Edward stepped closer, calm and certain, his face unreadable except for the quiet conviction in his eyes. "I have never been more serious in my life." Naomi shook her head immediately, standing so fast the chair scraped softly against the floor. "No. No, I cannot let you do that." Edward frowned slightly. "Why not?" A bitter laugh escaped her lips, broken by tears. "Because people do not just give away $180,000 to strangers." Edward's gaze softened. Then maybe tonight I am trying to stop being the kind of person who normally would not. Naomi opened her mouth, but nothing came out. Her hands trembled at her sides as emotions overwhelmed her all over again. For a moment she looked as though she might collapse from the pressure of it all. Then suddenly she stepped forward and wrapped both arms around him without warning, burying her face against his chest as sobs overtook her completely. Edward froze. His entire body locked in surprise. It had been years since anyone touched him with that kind of raw emotion, years since anyone held him without fear, expectation, or pretense. Slowly, awkwardly at first, his arms lifted and settled gently around her shoulders. He stood there in the middle of the hospital room, holding a crying waitress in his arms while the rain tapped softly against the glass outside, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, Edward Whitmore felt needed for something that had nothing to do with money or business. Isaiah smiled weakly from the bed, watching them. "I told you God would send somebody," he whispered. Naomi pulled back quickly, embarrassed, wiping her eyes. "I am sorry," she said breathlessly. "I should not have done that." Edward surprised himself by giving the faintest smile. "It is fine." He immediately turned and made several phone calls right there in the room, his voice calm, commanding, and direct. Within 15 minutes, hospital administrators who normally took days to respond were suddenly appearing in person. Specialists were called. Paperwork was expedited. Meetings were arranged. Doors that had remained shut for Naomi for months swung open within an hour simply because Edward Whitmore asked them to. Naomi watched in stunned silence as her brother's future transformed in front of her eyes. By midnight, Isaiah was officially approved for the treatment. By 1 in the morning, Naomi sat curled in a chair beside his bed while Isaiah slept peacefully, still overwhelmed by everything that had happened. Edward stood near the window, his coat draped over one arm, preparing to leave. Naomi looked up at him softly. "Why are you doing this, really?" she asked. Edward was quiet for several seconds. Then he answered honestly. "Because when my wife was dying, she asked me to stay with her that night." Naomi listened silently. His eyes lowered to the floor. "I chose a business dinner instead because I thought there would always be more time." His voice grew rougher. "There was not." Naomi's expression softened instantly. Edward stared out into the dark city beyond the glass. "I built an empire after she died because it was easier than facing the truth. Easier than admitting all this money means nothing if you fail the people you love." His jaw tightened. "Tonight, when you spoke to me outside that restaurant," he looked at her finally. "It felt like hearing her voice all over again." Naomi's eyes filled with tears once more, but gentler now. She stood and walked closer to him slowly. "Then maybe she sent me to remind you," she whispered. Edward's entire face changed. It was subtle, but unmistakable. Like something frozen inside him had finally begun to thaw. He stared at her, unable to speak. Then a soft voice interrupted them from the bed. "Hey, rich guy," Isaiah mumbled sleepily. Edward turned. "Yes?" Isaiah smiled faintly beneath his blankets. "If I get better, will you come play basketball with me sometime?" Edward blinked in surprise, then smiled wider than Naomi had seen all night. "Yes," he said softly. "I think I would like that very much." But none of them noticed the woman standing outside the hospital room door watching everything with narrowed eyes, her polished heels silent against the tile floor as jealousy and suspicion darkened her expression, because Victoria Langley had just arrived and she was not about to let Edward Whitmore change his life because of some waitress. Victoria Langley stood motionless outside the hospital room, her manicured hand tightening around the strap of her designer purse as she watched Edward Whitmore smile at the boy in the bed. She had known Edward for almost 7 years, served as his business partner for 3, and spent the last 2 trying to position herself as the obvious woman who would one day stand beside him in every magazine cover and charity gala. But never, not once, had she seen him smile at anyone the way he had just smiled at that little boy. Her lips pressed into a thin line. The next morning sunlight spilled pale and golden through the hospital windows, warming the white floors as Naomi sat beside Isaiah's bed half asleep in the chair, still wearing yesterday's wrinkled uniform. She woke to soft knocking at the door and blinked in surprise when Edward stepped inside carrying a paper bag and 2 coffee cups. "Good morning," he said. Naomi straightened quickly. "You came back?" The words slipped out before she could stop them. Edward smiled faintly. "I said I would." He handed her one of the coffees and set the paper bag on her lap. "Bagel. Bacon, egg, and cheese." "I guessed." Naomi stared at him, stunned. "You remembered my order?" Edward gave a small shrug. "You served me enough times." "I noticed." Naomi smiled softly, touched in a way she could not explain. Before she could answer, the room door suddenly swung open again. Victoria entered in a tailored cream coat and heels sharp enough to click like warning signs across the floor. Her eyes landed immediately on Naomi, then on the breakfast in Edward's hand, and the tension in the room shifted at once. "Edward," Victoria said with a polished smile that did not reach her eyes. "You missed the investor breakfast this morning." Again. Edward's expression cooled instantly. "I had more important things to do." Victoria glanced toward Naomi with poorly hidden disdain. "Apparently." Naomi immediately stood. "I can leave." "No," Edward said sharply. Victoria raised one brow. "Interesting." She stepped closer, lowering her voice but not enough to hide the edge in it. "Edward, may I speak to you outside?" Edward hesitated, then nodded and followed her into the hallway. Naomi could not hear every word, but their raised voices carried enough. "You are canceling meetings over a waitress now?" Victoria snapped. "She is not just a waitress," Edward replied coldly. Victoria laughed bitterly. "Do not tell me this is about guilt. You cannot save every tragic person in New York because they cry in front of you." Edward's jaw tightened. "Watch your tone." Victoria folded her arms. "No, you watch yours. You are acting irrational. People will talk. Board members are already asking questions." Edward stepped closer, voice low and dangerous. "Then let them ask." Victoria stared at him, stunned. "You are willing to risk your reputation over this?" Edward's answer came without hesitation. "My reputation survived worse than compassion." Naomi lowered her eyes, heart pounding as she listened from inside the room. A moment later Edward returned alone, face tense but composed. Victoria was gone. Naomi looked at him carefully. "I do not want to cause problems for you." Edward exhaled slowly and sat beside Isaiah's bed. "You are not the problem." But even as he said it, his phone buzzed in his pocket repeatedly. He ignored it. By afternoon Isaiah was taken for his first round of treatment. Naomi sat in the waiting room twisting her hands together while Edward remained beside her, both of them silent as nurses passed by and monitors beeped in distant halls. Hours later the doctor emerged smiling softly. "The procedure went well." Naomi broke down in tears instantly, covering her face in relief. Edward did not hesitate this time. He pulled her gently into his arms as she cried against him, trembling from release after months of fear. But across the room, hidden behind a corner, Victoria stood watching once again. Her eyes narrowed as she quietly raised her phone and snapped a picture of Edward holding Naomi. Then another. And another. Her lips curled into a cold smile as she whispered to herself, "If he wants to throw away everything for her, then I will make sure she destroys him first." The next 48 hours passed like a dream Naomi was afraid to wake from. Isaiah responded better to the first treatment than anyone expected, and by the second morning there was color returning to his cheeks that had not been there in weeks. Naomi sat beside his bed laughing softly while he told Edward terrible jokes about hospital food, and somehow the billionaire laughed along with him, loosening more each hour until even the nurses began whispering about how strange it was to see the famous Edward Whitmore smiling in a pediatric wing like he belonged there. Naomi noticed it too. She noticed the way his shoulders no longer seemed permanently tense when he walked into the room. The way he stayed even after business calls lit up his phone. The way he listened when Isaiah talked about basketball, school, comic books, and dreams for the future as if every word mattered. It was late that evening when Isaiah finally fell asleep and Naomi stepped quietly into the rooftop garden outside the hospital for air. The city skyline shimmered in the distance beneath a velvet black sky, lights glowing like stars fallen to earth. A cool breeze moved through the flower beds, carrying the faint scent of rain and fresh pavement. Naomi wrapped her arms around herself, breathing deeply, until she heard footsteps behind her. "Mind if I join you?" Edward asked softly. She turned and smiled. "It is a free country." He chuckled and stepped beside her at the railing, both of them staring out at the city below in comfortable silence. After a moment Naomi glanced at him. "You seem different here." Edward frowned slightly. "Different how?" Naomi smiled faintly. "Softer." He looked down, almost embarrassed. "I do not think anyone has ever called me soft before." "Maybe that is because they never gave you a reason to be." That answer lingered between them. Edward stared at her for a long moment before speaking quietly. "I spent so many years becoming someone people respected that I forgot how to become someone people loved." Naomi's expression softened deeply. "Those are not always the same thing." Edward gave a small bitter smile. "No. They are not." He leaned forward against the railing, eyes fixed on the glowing streets below. "After Claire died, I stopped letting people get close. It felt safer that way. Easier." Naomi stepped closer beside him. "And was it?" Edward's answer came instantly. "No." The honesty of it made them both smile sadly. Then Naomi looked up at the stars and whispered, "Pain has a way of making people build walls so high they forget they trap themselves inside." Edward turned his head sharply toward her. "How do you always know exactly what to say?" Naomi laughed softly. "Because I have spent my whole life hurting too." Their eyes met, and for a brief moment neither moved. The city hummed below them. Wind danced softly around them. Something warm and fragile passed silently in the space between their bodies, something neither one seemed ready to name aloud. Then Edward lifted his hand slowly and brushed a loose strand of hair from her face, his fingertips lingering for half a second too long. Naomi's breath caught. Edward stared at her, his voice barely above a whisper. "Naomi!" But before he could finish, both of their phones buzzed at once. Naomi pulled hers out first and frowned. Her blood turned cold instantly. Edward checked his own and his entire expression hardened. There on both of their screens was the same image. A photo of Edward holding Naomi in the hospital waiting room, posted online by every major gossip outlet in the city with the headline, "Billionaire mogul secretly romancing waitress while company stock falls." Naomi's face went pale. Her breathing quickened. "Oh no!" Edward's jaw clenched so tightly it flexed visibly. His phone buzzed again and again with incoming calls from board members, investors, reporters. Naomi looked at him in panic. "This is because of me." Edward immediately shook his head. "No." But she stepped backward, already trembling. "I ruined everything. Your business, your reputation." "Naomi, stop." But tears filled her eyes. "I should not have let myself believe this was real." Edward's face fell. "What?" She shook her head, crying now. "Men like you do not stay in worlds like mine, Edward. They visit them. Then leave." Before he could answer, she turned and rushed past him toward the stairwell, tears blurring her vision. Edward stood frozen for 1 second before running after her, but by the time he reached the hallway she was already gone. And downstairs in the shadows near the elevator, Victoria Langley smiled to herself as she slipped her phone back into her purse, watching everything unfold exactly as she had planned. Naomi did not stop running until she reached the empty parking garage across from the hospital, her breath ragged and tears blurring the rows of concrete pillars around her. Rain had started again, soft at first, then harder, drumming against the rooftop above as she stood trembling beside her old sedan with both hands pressed against her mouth, trying to stop herself from breaking apart completely. She felt foolish, embarrassed, ashamed for ever letting herself believe a man like Edward Whitmore could look at her and see anything more than a temporary distraction in a painful season of his life. Meanwhile, 20 floors above her, Edward stormed through the hospital corridor with his phone pressed hard against his ear, fury radiating off him in waves. "Find out who leaked those photographs," he snapped at his head of security. "I want every camera feed, every access log, every employee badge scan from the last 48 hours. Now." He hung up and turned sharply, only to find Isaiah awake in bed staring at him. "Did my sister leave?" the boy asked quietly. Edward's anger vanished instantly. He nodded once. Isaiah lowered his eyes. "She cries when she thinks people do not want her around." The words hit Edward harder than any accusation ever could. He stepped closer to the bed. "That is not why she left." Isaiah looked up. "Then why?" Edward hesitated, then answered honestly. "Because someone made her think caring about me would hurt me." Isaiah studied him for a moment with the strange wisdom children sometimes carried. "Then go tell her they are wrong." Edward blinked. "What?" Isaiah rolled his eyes dramatically despite his weakness. "You are old, but girls still like honesty, right?" Edward laughed despite himself, then leaned down and squeezed the boy's shoulder gently. "Thank you." 30 minutes later, Edward's phone rang. His security chief's voice came through immediately. "Sir, we traced the leak. The hospital footage shows Victoria Langley taking photos outside the waiting room and forwarding them to a media contact." Edward's entire expression darkened. "Prepare the boardroom. Tomorrow morning." By sunrise the next day, Whitmore Global's executive board sat in tense silence around the polished glass conference table, while rain streaked against the windows behind them. Victoria entered confidently, assuming she was there for damage control, until Edward walked in with a tablet in hand and eyes like steel. He set the device on the table. "Before we begin," he said coldly, "I would like everyone to see something." He pressed play. Security footage filled the screen, clearly showing Victoria taking secret photos, sending messages, and speaking to a reporter in the hallway. The room erupted in stunned whispers. Victoria's face went white. "Edward, I can explain." "No," he cut in sharply. "You tried to destroy an innocent woman because your jealousy outweighed your decency." Victoria stood abruptly. "I did it for this company." Edward slammed his palm lightly on the table, his voice thunderous. "No. You did it because you cannot stand the thought of me caring for someone who is not you." Silence crashed over the room. Edward straightened his jacket. "You are terminated effective immediately." Victoria stared in horror. "You cannot fire me over this." Edward stepped closer, his voice dropping into something ice cold. "Watch me." Security entered within seconds. Victoria was escorted out in stunned humiliation while every executive in the room sat speechless. But Edward did not stay to celebrate. The second she was gone, he grabbed his coat and left. Across town, Naomi sat in her tiny apartment by the window, still wearing yesterday's clothes, staring blankly into a cup of untouched coffee while her phone remained silent beside her. Her heart ached with every passing minute. She told herself it had all been foolish fantasy, that she should have known better. Then suddenly someone knocked at the door. Her breath caught. Slowly she stood and opened it. Edward Whitmore stood there soaked from the rain, chest rising and falling hard, his hair damp, eyes full of urgency. Naomi stared speechless. Edward looked at her for one breathless second before saying the word she never expected. "I am here because I should have said this sooner." He stepped closer. "You were wrong last night." Naomi's lips parted. Edward's voice softened. "Men like me do not visit worlds like yours and leave." His eyes locked onto hers. "Not when someone in that world becomes the reason they want to stay." Naomi's eyes filled instantly with tears as the rain poured behind him and the world around them seemed to disappear. Naomi stood frozen in the doorway, tears shimmering in her eyes as rainwater dripped from Edward's coat onto the floor between them. For a moment neither of them moved. The air itself felt charged, fragile, like one wrong breath might break whatever was happening between them. Then Naomi whispered the only thing her trembling heart could manage. "Do not say things like that unless you mean them." Edward stepped closer, his voice low and steady. "I have never meant anything more." Her lips parted as tears spilled down her cheeks again, but this time they were not from pain. Edward lifted one hand slowly and gently brushed the tears from her face, his touch soft and careful as though she were something precious. "You changed me, Naomi," he whispered. "The night I saw you crying, I thought I was looking at weakness. But all I was really seeing was someone strong enough to keep loving even when life gave her every reason not to." Naomi broke then, throwing her arms around him as emotion overtook her completely. Edward caught her instantly, holding her tightly against him in the doorway while rain poured behind him and the world outside disappeared into gray blur. For the first time in years, Edward Whitmore felt his heart beat for something other than survival. The next several weeks changed everything. Isaiah continued treatment, and improved every day. Color returned to his skin. His laughter grew louder. Nurses began joking that his room had become the happiest one on the floor because Edward and Naomi practically lived there between visits, card games, movies, and endless teasing from Isaiah, who constantly reminded Edward that he still owed him a basketball game once he was healthy enough. The tabloids never stopped talking, but Edward did not care. For the first time in his life, public opinion felt smaller than private happiness. Then one bright afternoon, 6 weeks later, Isaiah was officially discharged from the hospital. Naomi cried openly as nurses hugged them goodbye and Isaiah rolled out in a wheelchair wearing sunglasses and grinning like he had just conquered the world. Outside the hospital doors, sunlight poured across the sidewalk in warm golden waves. Edward stood waiting beside a black SUV, smiling as Isaiah threw his hands into the air. "Freedom!" the boy yelled. Naomi laughed harder than Edward had ever heard her laugh, pure and bright and beautiful. Then Isaiah suddenly looked between them with a mischievous grin. "So, are you two finally dating or what?" Naomi nearly choked in embarrassment. Edward laughed deeply. "Straight to the point, huh?" Isaiah crossed his arms. "I almost died. I deserve answers." Naomi covered her face while Edward knelt beside Isaiah's wheelchair and smiled. "Yes," he said simply. "We are." Isaiah cheered so loudly people across the parking lot turned to stare. Weeks later, Edward kept his promise and took Isaiah to the private basketball court behind his estate, where the boy laughed himself breathless trying to teach a billionaire in dress shoes how to improve his jump shot. Naomi stood nearby laughing until tears formed in her eyes watching the two of them together beneath the late afternoon sun. Edward walked over afterward, breathing hard and smiling, and slipped his hand into hers naturally, like it had always belonged there. "You know," Naomi said softly, staring out at the glowing sunset painting the sky orange and pink, "I still cannot believe all of this started because I cried in front of the wrong customer." Edward smiled gently. "No." He turned toward her, squeezing her hand. "It started because the right woman said the right words to a man who desperately needed to hear them." Naomi stared at him, emotion filling her chest. Then Edward reached into his pocket and pulled out something small. Naomi frowned. "What is that?" Edward opened his palm to reveal a delicate silver key. "A key to my house," he said softly. Naomi's eyes widened. Edward's voice lowered. "Because I do not want you visiting my life anymore either." Tears instantly filled Naomi's eyes again. "Edward," he smiled warmly, "I want you in it. Permanently." Naomi threw her arms around him as the sun dipped lower behind them, wrapping the entire world in gold. But several feet away, Isaiah watched with crossed arms and a fake grimace. "Okay, this is getting disgustingly emotional," he muttered loudly. Edward and Naomi burst into laughter. Yet none of them noticed the elderly woman standing at the edge of the driveway watching the scene unfold from afar, tears streaming down her face as she whispered one trembling sentence to herself. "Claire, he finally learned how to love again." 3 months later, autumn painted the city in gold and amber, and the air carried that crisp October chill that made every breath feel clean and new. Naomi stood on the balcony of Edward's penthouse wrapped in one of his oversized sweaters, a mug of coffee warming her hands as morning sunlight spilled across the skyline beyond. She smiled softly to herself as she watched Edward below in the courtyard laughing while Isaiah attempted to teach him another ridiculous basketball trick he had clearly invented 5 seconds earlier. "No, no, you have to spin first," Isaiah shouted. "That is not a real move." Edward laughed. "It is if you believe in yourself." Naomi shook her head, smiling wider than she had in years. Life had changed so completely that sometimes it still did not feel real. Isaiah's treatments were working better than anyone expected. His doctors now spoke in hopeful terms instead of cautious ones. Naomi had left the restaurant behind after Edward offered her a position helping run the Whitmore Foundation, where she now worked directly with families struggling under medical debt, turning her pain into purpose for people who needed the same miracles she once had. And Edward was no longer the man she first met. He still ran billion-dollar meetings and wore expensive suits, but now he left work on time. He answered family calls in the middle of meetings without apology. He smiled more, laughed more, lived more. The old emptiness in his eyes had vanished, replaced by warmth that made him look 10 years younger. That evening Edward insisted they all dress nicely for dinner, though he refused to explain why. Naomi arrived downstairs in a deep emerald dress that made Edward visibly forget how to breathe for a moment, earning a dramatic groan from Isaiah. "Can you stop staring at her like a lovesick movie character for 5 seconds?" the boy muttered. Edward laughed, while Naomi blushed. Dinner took place on the rooftop terrace beneath glowing string lights and flickering candles while the city glittered behind them like 1,000 stars scattered across black velvet. Halfway through dessert, Edward suddenly stood. Naomi frowned. "Why are you looking nervous?" Edward smiled faintly. "Because for the first time in my life, money cannot solve what I am about to ask." Naomi's breath caught instantly. Isaiah's eyes widened. "No way," he whispered, nearly knocking over his drink in excitement. Edward slowly walked around the table and knelt in front of Naomi, pulling a velvet box from his pocket. Tears filled her eyes before he even opened it. "Naomi Carter," he said softly, his voice trembling despite his smile. "You walked into my life when I was too broken to even realize I needed saving. You reminded me that success means nothing if your heart is empty. You taught me grief can heal, love can return, and second chances exist for those brave enough to take them." By now Naomi was openly crying, one hand pressed over her mouth. Edward's eyes glistened too. "You and Isaiah became the family I thought I lost forever. So if you will let me..." He opened the box, revealing a diamond ring that caught the candlelight like fire. "I would like to spend the rest of my life loving you the way I should have loved this world all along." Naomi could not even speak. She nodded rapidly through tears before finally whispering, "Yes. Yes, of course, yes." Edward slipped the ring onto her shaking hand and stood just as Naomi threw her arms around him, both of them laughing and crying together while Isaiah jumped up shouting loud enough for neighboring rooftops to hear. Months later, on a bright spring afternoon beneath white roses and clear blue skies, Naomi walked down the aisle toward Edward with Isaiah proudly beside her, healthy enough now to stand tall in his suit and grin at everyone watching. Edward's eyes filled with tears the second he saw her. And far in the back row, seated quietly with hands folded in her lap, an older woman dabbed her eyes with a tissue. Claire's mother smiled softly through tears as she whispered toward the heavens, "You can rest now, sweetheart." He found his way home. As Naomi reached the altar, Edward took her hands in his and whispered so only she could hear, "The night you cried in front of me, I thought I was witnessing someone falling apart." He kissed her trembling fingers gently. "But really, I was watching the woman who would put my whole life back together." Naomi smiled through tears as sunlight poured over them both, warm and golden and endless, and in that perfect quiet moment Edward Whitmore finally understood the truth that had changed everything. Sometimes the people we ignore in passing become the very souls who save us.